What's up, Bitcoiners? Sun's up. Sun is up. Bitcoin totally running. All that's left to do is have a coffee and talk about what's new. Hi, Kevin. Yo, Bitcoin Graffiti. Good evening, Endimity. So just to let you know, the sun is on its way to you. It's going to rise where you are shortly. You're going to see it just like we do. It's going to be great, right? Not long now. Everyone knows we like to start the show with the fakest news we can find. And today, I got a pretty good one, right? I got a pretty good one. And what it should fit into the theme we have today, which is really about the incredulousness, the lack of authority anyone could derive from being in a position of authority these days with the kind of clown world display that we have going on, with the utter failure and incompetence at every level and everywhere you look. Just showing that the system is completely incentivized to crash and burn at this point. But this, you know, what I want to imagine here, so this is the Dutch Central Bank, right? The Dutch Central Bank. And I'll read it to you, but I'm going to give you the setup first, right? I'm going to try and paint a picture of how I would imagine this got created. You've got, it just sounds like it was written, right? You know, they're already years late in the explainer videos, right? So they probably put explainer videos out before, or explainer texts, or any of those things before. But here they are trying it again, right? It's 2023, and Bitcoin has been out for 14 years now. And we've had cryptos, as they call them, cryptos, around for quite a while. And the Dutch Central Bank here, with its info letter, buying and selling cryptos. While unbanked cryptos are unsuitable as a means of payment, they are attractive for gambling. For gambling, wow, you know. And I just want to say, you know, one of the first things that I noticed about Bitcoin that gave it a lot of credit, dealers indeed liked it, right? So whenever anyone would say to me when I was doing the early evangelist Bitcoin stuff in 2015 and 2016, I just copied Andreas Antonopoulos's argument there, and it still applies, right? If criminals take it, it's money. That's all you need to know. If a drug dealer is going to take it, you can bet there's some good qualities about it. And I still keep that in my bio. Being a Bitcoiner, I say, you know, once I noticed it was used for drug dealing, I said, well, maybe it can do other things, right? So maybe it can do lots more. So here they say it's, you know, so the gambling part, again, gambling means it's real money, right? You got to remember that. Despite warnings of the real risk of losing money, cryptos are becoming increasingly popular. Oh, are they? In the summer of 2022, an estimated 14% of the Dutch population held cryptos. However uncertain they are, many people seem to be in fear of missing out. So FOMO, they got that right. That's the one part they got right. Many types of cryptos are in circulation. New ones are introduced on a daily basis, while others disappear. Well-known cryptos are Bitcoin, Ether, and Ethereum. So there's 2 Ethereums in this one. And here's the big worry for them. There is no financial authority regulating their value. Oh, that's the warning. So, you know, this is one of these things where it was like they had, you know, lost the best staff years ago who could have explained this. And they're left with people who haven't even heard about the industry. They don't even know what's going on. And they're asking those people to write the info letter about the industry to people who already know way more than them. It reminds me of when I did the Senate study and the time I got Andreas at our hearings in 2014, I got him. And at the beginning of that year, I had the hearings from Bank of Canada and the finance minister, or the finance ministry, as witnesses, and they didn't know what they were talking about. I was sitting there saying, like, they didn't know anything. They don't know any. They were reading each other's notes. They were literally reading off of notes that other people had written and came and thought it was good testimony. So it looks like IQ level of the people running this stuff not so great, right? Which is good news for us. It is good news, right? Hard to beat. Now, you know, you can think about central authorities and how incompetent these people are, but we have that Gell-Mann amnesia again, right? The Gell-Mann amnesia, which is the ability to sort of forget when you're an expert in one story and you see misinformation or low information or a bad take. When you're reading the newspaper, you say, oh, because I'm an expert in this, I can recognize how stupid this is. And then you turn the page and it's on a field that you're not an expert in, but you commit to listening and understanding, as if that person who wrote the article is an expert. So this Gell-Mann amnesia effect is actually starting to get broken in some places. We saw the Peter Zeihan interview that everyone continues to talk about, but we saw an interesting thing with the Peter Zeihan interview in that everyone who is an expert in every one of the subjects he spoke about during the 3-hour Joe Rogan thing said, Zeihan, you're not right. This is full of shit. So pretty interesting to watch the Gell-Mann amnesia effect actually get seized up with the way Twitter is functioning these days and the amount of energy and attention that is there. And, this whole thing about the central bankers and that sort of appeal to authority and we're in a position and we know better becomes unmasked really quickly when people who are at least familiar with Bitcoin, Ether, and Ethereum, right, can know that whatever it is they're selling is coming from someone who's not credible, not an expert, and really doesn't know anything. It's just their job. It's a 9-to-5 thing, and they had a job to do, which is to write. They did it, right? But put that in context now of experts doing a job, if they're capable, if they're not capable. The biggest story today, this morning in America, is the Supreme Court, and this relates to the leak that happened a year ago before the summer related to the abortion and what was going on, and they were going to change the Wray decision, and the decision was leaked far before it was shared with the public. So the Supreme Court had an investigation because leaking in court documents, especially like these, are a big deal. When they talk about intimidation of congressmen or anything like that, people are leaving out that a lot of these Supreme Court judges had mobs outside of their house for most of the summer, right? It was a real thing. They were real threats on the judiciary. And if you look at the republic as it is, right, we don't really have much going on anymore as far as a republic goes. A little bit in Congress. Senate looks like a wasteland. Executive is, worried about the Hunter files all the time, right? There's not really much of a credible republic left. There are little pieces of it hiding. Mostly it's in our minds, right? Which is good enough. We don't need it expressed in the country as it is. We'll be able to catch up and fix things. But how far does the rot go, right? So everyone commenting this morning because the Supreme Court was unable to find the leaker, right? It's a big deal because the leak allowed for pressure to be put on the court, which makes the court useless in some ways, right? If there can be pressure on the court, they're not independent anymore and they can't do their jobs, which is be independent. So the Supreme Court looked into it's called the Dobbs leak and tried to find out. So Jonathan Turley breaks it down. He says the Supreme Court's report indicates that they cannot isolate the culprit among the over 80 possible suspects for the Dobbs leak. It is an admission that is almost as chilling as the leak itself. It will likely revive concerns over whether the FBI should have been asked to take the lead in the investigation. The court is only a few blocks from the world's leading forensic investigative body. What is clear is that any hope for a deterrent to such unethical conduct has been dramatically reduced. Thus far, the culprit succeeded in not just leaking the opinion, but in evading detection. So, he goes on to talk about danger and but I want to go back to what he said about the FBI, right? Because this is what I think is interesting. He says, it'll likely revive concerns over whether the FBI should have gone into the investigation. Well, we're talking about the credibility and integrity of the Republic here. And what I just said is that the Republic can only really be found in a few little corners of the entire system now, right? There's a little bit of the Republic left. I'll even go out and say Ilhan Omar, even though she's been kicked off of a lot of the committees. Look, she is a small donor financed person. She's different from the rest of her party. She is. And she's voted against war stuff, and she's been a little harder to muzzle than a lot of other people. So while I disagree with Ilhan Omar on everything, right? I can recognize her at least as part of the Republic. I can. She is, right? She's small donor. She has a mandate from people. Whether or not I agree with them doesn't matter. I'm not trying to get total agreement, but I'd say Ilhan Omar is one example of someone who's still expressing the way the Republic ought to work. There are probably more on the Republican side, the 20 that fought against McCarthy. I'd put them as part of what's left of the Republic, right? There's pieces all over the place. But when we're talking about whether or not the Supreme Court, which is one of the last functioning pieces of the Republic, whether you like their decisions or not. That's what it is. It's a functioning piece of the republic. Whether they ask the FBI for help or not becomes an important question. It becomes an important question, right? What Jonathan Turley says here is the court is the leading forensic investigative body in the world. So why didn't they ask them in the first place? Why weren't they involved in this investigation in the first place? I understand the Supreme Court might want to keep things, in-house and be able to control it, but they failed to do it. Well, I wonder if things like the FBI director at Davos, and we're going to get into the history of all of this, is one of the reasons why. So, and what I mean is, what we saw the FBI director yesterday, so he was in Davos, right? Everyone's still talking about Davos. The FBI director was there, and here's what he said, right? The Davos Watch. Director of FBI Christopher Wray says the level of collaboration between the private sector and the government, especially the FBI, has made significant strides. It's made strides. It's gotten better, he says. He states the FBI is concerned about technology getting into what they determine are the wrong hands, right? So here's DC Drano saying the FBI director is openly bragging at the corrupt WEF about how much the FBI partners with big tech to censor the free speech of Americans. Apparently the Twitter files didn't scare them. The FBI seems proud of its tyranny. Mike Lee goes on to say, this is based Mike Lee, this brings to mind a September 2020 classified briefing to senators when the FBI warned us about misinformation, possibly driven by a foreign government, that was about to come forward about a member of the Biden family. They said we should neither believe nor share any such news. We're, of course, talking about the Hunter Biden laptop, which we know now is totally real. It's totally real, right? So you go back and you wonder why the Supreme Court, as I'm saying, one of the last vestiges of the Republic, says, keep it to yourself, FBI. We're going to look into it. So why wouldn't they ask them, right? Why wouldn't they ask them? Well, if you look at what's happening in the Twitter files, it's very difficult to even assume you're going to get a credible or you're going to get any degree of helpful information. The FBI will do what's good for them, right? Maybe you'll get a good agent or whatever, but it looks like they control absolutely every story they touch. Every investigation of political significance has in it the benefit for the FBI. Here's a quote that I got from, what's his name? Doombert today on exactly that, where Doombert says, the police are not here to create disorder. They're here to preserve disorder. And it's from Richard Daley, but Doombert quoted it, and that's where I got it from. And, in a lot of ways, that is kind of what's going on, right? And how long has this been going on for? Well, our good friend Tucker Carlson did a whole show on it last night, and it was amazing. I had never seen a lot of this stuff put in order. And what did Tucker Carlson talk about yesterday? Well, he got into where this might have all gone awry, where we might have started to lose pieces of the Republic, where we've seen it degrade to the point where it's degraded to today. When did the rot set in? We've talked a lot about LBJ and the JFK assassination here. This relates to it directly. So Tucker Carlson did another show on it last night. He started by asking, did you know who the most popular president in American history is? Does anyone know? It's Nixon. Nixon is the most popular president in American history. I knew that. He won by 17 million votes in his re-election, and it's the largest margin of victory in the history of the role, right? So no one had ever been more popular than he was in 1972 vis-a-vis his competitor. He was, of course, elected for the first time in '68 after a huge comeback. So he was the vice president under Eisenhower, Nixon was, and then he became the candidate against Kennedy. And actually hated Kennedy, right? Got angry about the debates and how he lost and Kennedy won, and believed Kennedy did steal the election. He believed that until his dying days, that the election was stolen in Chicago by the election machine. And it looks like it's true. It was the case, but I don't offer proof on that. I just remember reading it from someone who did credibly look into it, and I could have been fooled because I never looked it up and paid much attention to it. But that's what the story is. Nixon wins in '68 after he's already lost the governorship of California. So when he loses the president in '60, he goes and tries to run for the governor of California, loses. That's where he gives the famous, you won't have old Nixon to kick around anymore, talking about the media and how hard they were on him. So he comes back out of nowhere and wins the '68 primaries. What's he promising? To get out of Vietnam, right? To bring peace in Vietnam, peace with honor, he called it, right? So his whole plan was to get out of wars and all those things. So he doubles down on that mandate in 1972 and says he's going to become, they're going to get out of Vietnam and all these things are going to happen. And he wins the largest ever, so largest in the history of the country. And then he, at the same time, is talking about stuff like the Twitter files, FBI and CIA collusion with government agencies and political agencies in order to push agendas that had nothing to do with the American population. He was already hinting at a deep state during his presidency. He said it openly, so that you can fact check as much as you'd like, because he was very clear that there were pieces within the US government that were working against him. And he spoke about it openly, regularly, all the time. And if you didn't know this about Nixon, right, the thing that ended up undoing him were the Nixon tapes, because he recorded absolutely everything he ever said in the office. And one of those recordings were when the CIA director at the time, let me just get, Richard Helms came in, and this was in 73, maybe. So he's been reelected and been president for a little while. So he comes in and is asking about all this Twitter file type stuff, right? Like, what do you do, and how's this? It's going too far here. I believe you're hiding people who are against me and the administration, and therefore the country, and what's going on. And he even says to him in the recording, right, I know who killed JFK. And he says, it was you guys. You were involved in it, right? In the recording, he says that, right? And in the recording, the CIA director is quiet, doesn't say anything. Little did Nixon know that this was the beginning of summer. Just 4 days earlier, Watergate had happened, the event, the break-in, right? The break-in, which everyone admits he didn't know about it. It was the committee for the re-election of Richard Nixon that independently did this. Nixon absolutely never got involved, and that was never at issue, right? That's never been the case. Nixon never went, oh, go spy on these people. So there were, I guess, 5 people who were part of the break-in, maybe 4. But it turns out, 4 of the 5 were working for the FBI. Just like we saw with some J6 stuff, just like we saw with the Whitmer thing and the kidnapping, right? They were agents. So they get him on that, and then it doesn't stop. Now, here are some other details I didn't know. So the Washington Post starts printing stories on this. The Washington Post gave the story to, so the big media outlet, right, gave the story to Bob Woodward, right? He's the guy who they still bring on TV all the time to say, worse than Watergate. This is worse than Watergate, right? They bring him every time. He says the same thing. He just does the same job all the time. He comes in and says whatever Trump did with Mueller is worse than Watergate. And he's been doing that for years, right? It's literally the same show every single time. The only reason they call this guy is for him to drop his one-liner, right? Worse than Watergate. So this guy, he actually worked for the CIA. He had no experience as a journalist whatsoever. His first job in journalism was with the Washington Post, and the first story they gave him was this one, the Watergate Hotel. He worked for the classified division of the Pentagon CIA before that, right? Okay. So here's a guy who of a lifetime and ends up turning it into the narrative, the most popular president in the history of the country. And happened simultaneous to that is his number one was this guy who worked for the FBI, whose job was to discredit politicians. And he had done it to Spiro Agnew, vice president of Nixon's first administration. And in the maneuvering, Gerald Ford was the man foisted onto Nixon to be the vice president in that 72 win. So within a short amount of time, within the period of time where Nixon says to the FBI or the CIA director, I know who killed Jack, the most popular president in American history is replaced by our only unelected president. We've never had one unelected, ever. There's never been an unelected president before. Teddy Roosevelt took the job after McKinley was killed in 1900, but it was elected in the next one. So that erased it. The same thing happened to FDR's guy, Truman, And we'll do a show on Truman one day. I'm a big Truman fan, by the way, a major Truman fan. Truman was the same. He was elected right after, right? So FDR died, but Truman was elected nevertheless. So assassinations were usually followed by re-elections. Gerald Ford, right, remains our only unelected president in the history of the United States. And Gerald Ford, what did he do in his whole career before that? He ran the Warren Commission. He was on the commission that looked into the Kennedy thing, right? So he became the vice president. And who did he put on his staff right away? Right. Well, he took the CIA guy away and put the first Bush, who later became president, in charge of it. If you didn't know this part, that Bush was the last person. He was the head of the Republican committee at the time. Right. There's an election right now for the Republican National Committee chair, who runs the political party, and that's what Bush was doing at the time, which was already a weird demotion, right? Because he had come from the ambassador to the UN, where he was spending all his time in the New York UN office next to the Saudis and next to everyone else who had the oil money and all that stuff, because he was running his oil stuff down in Texas simultaneous. So, and how did he end up in Texas in the first place? Well, some people say, right, he was in Dallas. Some people say, I have no proof, right, but some people say he was there in 1963. And so Bush Sr. now becomes the director of the CIA. Rumsfeld, who will later be in Bush Sr.'s administration and Bush Jr.'s administration, goes to work with Gerald Ford. And it looks like that's where you get the uniparty of corruption. That's where the uniparty of corruption comes in, where you start having the small-time criminal type LBJ behavior from 1963, and it was fought against. The Republic was stronger. It was able to repel these things. But insidiously, these organizations worked through the 1970s in order to change perception on what was going on and who was in charge. And what did we end up with? We ended up with the guy who was the patsy for the Warren Commission, Gerald Ford, being the first and only unelected president of the United States, with Bush in the wings taking over the CIA immediately after all of this happens, after he is basically the last one who put the knife into Nixon, because as the chair of the party, he was the guy who had to, who basically was the one who told Nixon to his face, you're done, right? Once the party was against him, he had no more backers, and that's when Nixon had to resign, right? He had to resign at that point. So here you get this story. Now we're talking about narrative bias, and I have narrative bias, and you have narrative bias. So there's a lot of narrative bias in what I'm seeing here, but that doesn't make it not true, and it doesn't make it not accurate. And as a Bitcoiner looking back in history, explaining corruption, this is what it ends up looking like, right? This is exactly what it ends up looking like. This is what a deep state functioning at this level would look like. They tried to turn Trump into exactly the same caricature that they turned Nixon into, as this criminal, and everyone knows he was a criminal, and all this stuff. Now, I have a personal connection to Nixon, which is really interesting. When I said, so I come from a really crazy town, right? I don't know why the town is the way it is. When I say, I mean amazing, really an amazing. It's about an hour from Montreal. It's on the border with Vermont. It's a little bit like the Hamptons, or one of these vacation places for really wealthy people. Not from a wealthy family. My mother worked in a restaurant in the area. I worked in the restaurant since I was a kid. But it's still a small town, and the mentality is, with a lot of these wealthy people, if you work hard, they'll pay for stuff and give you money. There's no material want whatsoever, put it that way. It's a very wealthy town. And through the town, right, a lot of these people have come through in my lifetime. And a lot of interesting people have come through in my lifetime. And one of the people who helped me a great deal in life, a mentor of mine, was partners with a guy named Conrad Black. Conrad Black went to jail. He won his Supreme Court case eventually to get out of jail. He went to jail because he sued the Prime Minister of Canada, and it was a big thing. This guy owned newspapers. That's where his real fortune came. He was a billionaire who owned some newspapers. He owned most of the newspapers in Canada in the 1970s, 80s, sold them in the late 90s, national papers. He owned the Chicago Sun-Times, the Jerusalem Star, the London Daily Telegraph. and was a lord in England. And that's ended up the reason why he went to jail, more or less, is because he renounced his Canadian citizenship because he had to sue the prime minister who complained to the Queen that he was a lord and we're not supposed to be lords from Canada. Kissinger is the man who actually initiated him into the lordship. You had to get two people to like hold your hand when you become a lord. He had Margaret Thatcher and Henry Kissinger. So he owned all these newspapers, but his first newspaper, when he was just a young guy, was my village newspaper that I like wrote for. It was like my village newspaper. He bought it in the 1960s when he quit school. So the thing about him that you have to know about this Conrad Black guy, he's an autodidact. He has like 100% recall, and can describe entire books he's read in his life. So he wasn't just a newspaper magnate and all of these things. He was also just intellect off the charts. I mean, to this day, he's one of the best writers, one of the best thinkers out there. And he wrote the biography just as a hobby on Nixon. He did write it on Nixon, and I'll get to that. He wrote the biography on FDR, which if you study FDR, you have to read his biography. And then when he was first getting into this legal trouble, and they were pulling his companies away from him and accusing him of influence peddling and all kinds, not influence peddling. So in the end, they got him on this. He had taken a non-compete payment when he sold newspapers for both himself and for his company, arguing that I can start a newspaper personally at any time because he's a personality and a character and all that stuff. So they said to him, he just took the money and said, pay me the non-compete personally. And then all this white collar people trying to make a name for themselves, Enron, blah, 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 went after him because the non-compete, they said, was illegal for him personally. It should have gone to the shareholders. I mean, the stupidest thing you've ever heard. Right? And he goes to the Supreme Court and wins, by the way. They throw him into jail and he wins. He takes it as he's a lawyer. So not only was he the owner of the little village paper where I'm from, and I mean a village paper, he went to law school where I went to law school. And he built a little newspaper place for law students to read. But his partner lived in my town forever. And his partner was kind of like one of the best mentors you'll ever see or ever come across in your whole life. I mean, just one of the greatest people, one of the nicest people, one of the most thoughtful people. I became friends with him and, was keyed into these conservative, they were both, conservatives. But not the kind of conservative that, like they're not in, the social, they're not those kinds. But fiscal and in many ways, recognizable to Bitcoiners, I would say, as the type of small government people that they would, endorse. So these two fellas, were a big deal in my town. And the guy who ended up helping me, I worked in a little country club making sandwiches for the members. It's a sailing club on the lake. And, they had tennis courts after. And when I would be done my shift, I would go and play with some, a lot of pretty girls and cool guys. Everyone's nice. It's Canada, right? So no one's going to say, oh, the guy in the kitchen can't come play tennis, right? And so I would go and play tennis with them after my shift and just hang out and whatever. But of course, some lady had a problem because I should have been working and she complained. But the kind of guy that this fellow was, and he was the president of the club and the richest guy there and he said he wanted to kick her out just for saying that, right? Just for saying that a guy like me working there couldn't play at the tennis court. And, it sort of, and these were all national figures. Like these people were in the news in Canada. So the nice liberal telling me that I couldn't play, her husband was a famous doctor and on TV all the time, and they were the nice people and they were the ones telling me I wasn't allowed to play tennis. And then the super rich guy who was a mean conservative was like, this is absurd. Like, I will kick her out before you ever couldn't play tennis. It's absurd. We're not going to have a club like that. And right away, it sort of changed my perceptions. And even the way they fought, this was while Quebec separation was going on, the way they fought it was so different than I was being told in the media how to handle it. Be nice to Quebecers. And I love Quebecers. I'm the biggest Quebec lover going, right? All those things. But both of them had the point of view, well, if you want to separate Canada, we should be able to separate Quebec, and just play it like that. Don't argue, don't beg, just be real. Okay, sure, you want to break up? Well, this is what breakup looks like. And if you just tell it to them in those words, you'll win. And the way that Canada got caught up in the whole separation debate was sort of like trying to seduce Quebec. It's not the way to do it. It's just be real, right? It's not seduction. So all of that stuff changed my mind about a lot of things at a really early time in life. And when he started to get into his legal trouble, I volunteered because I was a law student. They'd taken all their money from them, right? They'd seized assets and seized cash. So I said, well, I'll help you, whatever you need as a researcher. I'm a law student. Like, I can't beat this kind of legal experience, right? This is great stuff. So let me have it, right? And so it started. And one of the guys I worked with on doing research, we both went to law school with him. He actually got asked by Conrad Black to help him write the biography on Richard Nixon, which came out in like 2006 or 2007 or something like that. And to this day, it's generally regarded as the greatest biography ever written on Richard Nixon. It was written, this guy, Connor, was already in jail, and my friend would have to go, he got access to all of the Nixon records at the Nixon Library. So my law school friend would fly down to the Nixon Library and get all the documents and put them together, and he'd bring them to the prison because he had to get them in the prison. He'd bring them to the prison in Florida. And, there's all kinds of newspaper articles written about this guy. When he was in prison, he became like a teacher and helped everyone get their high school, and until he fought it to the Supreme Court on his own and won. And won. An amazing guy. So all of this to say that when he wrote the Nixon biography, it was the first take I'd ever heard that opposed this. He's a criminal and Watergate's a scam, a crime, and all that. He was the first one to say it's probably all fake news. It's probably all fake news. And so I had been sort of white-pilled on Nixon years ago and understood that the story about him and the story and impressions that people had, and that Bob Woodward and the Washington Post was all a lie. It was fake news before fake news had been popularized. And so here we are, right? Here we are looking at things today, and it looks like, even the Supreme Court now, one of these last vestiges of the Republic, is unwilling to even work with the FBI because of fear and, I guess, knowledge that the swamp has now spread everywhere into the Republic. I mean, all over the place. And it could go back. It could go right back to this instance of the national security apparatus basically already having taken over the Democrat Party through LBJ, found its way into the Republican Party as well. And if you'll notice, this is when the switch in perceptions begins to happen. This is when things start to become 50-50. Now, when you look at American electoral history, that everything's sort of 50-50, you have to imagine that if you are going to orchestrate some form of top-down control, it's best to have two options, keep them close, and then just way into one side at one moment, and then the whole slime will just ooze into that direction, right? It's a momentum of slime type argument. And it looks like that's how uniparty control was established. And when you think about it, when you think about what Ben Hunt talking about Bitcoin, and I mentioned the other day when Doomberg was talking about LBJ and his corruption, and he was tying it to, and then quoted this in praise of Bitcoin piece by Ben Hunt, where, I missed that one part. You forgot the other part. When Ford becomes, this is Daniel reminding us, when Ford becomes VP, he gets Nelson Rockefeller to be the vice president. You can't make this shit up. You can't make this up. This is crazy. So, and I'll read to you again what Doomberg and Ben Hunt said in the context of LBJ, and you can now extend this context to the whole uniparty and the tatters of the Republic. So as the cancer of corruption grows, so too does the government's need to corral the outrage and the activities. In this regard, one weapon supersedes them all: the ability to control how ordinary citizens transact in the economy. As Ben Hunt brilliantly describes in his excellent piece In Praise of Bitcoin, the goal of the US government is to see and preside over all money in the world, because once that power is obtained, it's game over. And this is the key passage that he cites from Ben Hunt's piece. That's really all it is. That's what anti-money laundering regulations are all about. That's what know your client regulations are all about. That's what report on foreign bank and financial accounts regulations are all about. That's what the Treasury-led Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications, SWIFT, is all about. That's what the bank's all about. None of these programs are really about taxes. None of these programs are really about catching crooks or fighting terrorists. All of these programs are really about information for information's sake regarding the greatest source of power in the world and the raison d'etre of every government on earth: money. Indeed, indeed. But there's plenty of good news, right? We don't have to despair with what we've just read, right? The republic still can exist in people's minds. It still exists in these corners. Whether the Supreme Court could find out who leaked the stuff doesn't really matter, right? We still know what's going on. Just like the Munchkins in The Wizard of Oz, just like the Strong Man, just as everyone along the Yellow Brick Road still had an understanding of how the thing ought to work and could recognize that it had been corrupted and fallen, right? So the good news is, right, this whole point requires, as Doomberg said, the goal is to see and preside over all the money in the world, right? All the money in the world. Well, can they, right? Well, here's where it's cracking. We find out now the Department of Justice is thinking about, so not only did they seize the Russian reserves at the beginning of the war a year ago, it now looks like they're going to give them to Ukraine. So, okay, do it. Do it. There you go. Next, you get Wall Street Silver breaking down the current debt situation, right? With the Janet Yellen on this charm. We loved, they put Janet Yellen again on the charm campaign. She's got to go be charismatic and get people to do what she wants them to do, right? So here's what we got. We got total debt of 31 trillion. Annual interest is about 1.2 trillion a year. Tax revenues 4.9 trillion. The deficit's 1.4 trillion, and they're going to have about a $2 trillion deficit in a year. And this is what Wall Street Silver says. Personally, I think it's too late. There is no way for our political system to turn this around. The debt will continue piling up to 200% debt to GDP. The Fed will have to eventually do yield curve control and keep the interest expense from consuming all tax revenue. The likely course of action is for the Fed to copy Japan. What we've been saying on this show for a long time, to this day, the reason why we believe the Japanese name was chosen as the creator of Bitcoin, right? The point is to have the authority as a Japanese person to say to America, welcome to the party. You made choices. This is the bed you're lying in now. And I've always believed that. Don't know how I got that idea. So he says the likely course of action is for the Fed to copy Japan, take rates down to 0% again, and let all the debt roll over at yields between 0 and 1%. That eliminates most of the interest expenses of the government within a few years. But then they can't raise rates and inflation booms. And Elon Musk replied, even if you tax every billionaire in America at 100%, it barely makes a dent in the national debt. In the end, the government will be forced to tax everyone to pay the debt. But it looks like we're into the Japanification of everything, right? And he says, by the way, 31 trillion doesn't even include the unfunded liabilities. So that's not even included Social Security and the other things, right? So what's going to happen, right? We're going to need a new energy system, right? And is it going to be what they have in Germany? Sorry, we're going to need a new monetary system. And a new monetary system, as we argue on this show all the time, is likely going to continue the at least psychological construct of tying it to an energy source. So we went from the petrodollar, which created the demand for dollars in order to buy and sell and move petrochemicals around the world, right? But it isn't just the market purchasing and selling that matters. I think in many ways the measurement of the economy. Just the measurement is what's important. And the measurement of the energy markets, probably the most important. So the cost of oil in dollars was an important economic barometer in the world, right? It's one of the most fundamental data points from which all other financial information gains relevancy from, right? It is the source of reference in order to make sense of anything in the world around us. So it's interest rates from the central bank, it's cost of oil, and from there you can start building the models that help us navigate the world from a costs point of view and from a price discovery point of view. And if you take this, what we talk about a lot, this attempt to make a BRICS 2 currency, right? I continue to think that it's just not going to work. And in the end, they're going to take the currency that is already prepackaged and on the shelf that they can just take off, right? The Campbell's soup of monetary policies. But we need a little more than just that, right? We need a little more than just the failure of BRICS 2. And the good news is New Hampshire, right, has come up with it. New Hampshire has the answer. And it's what we've been talking about here on this show for a long time. So the government of New Hampshire, now compare this to what we just mentioned about the Dutch people at the start of the show, right? The cryptos, right? The cryptos, that's the central bank, right? Just to show you the quality of IQ that is now finding its way towards central banks. And now that we're opening our eyes to questioning all of these top-down appeals to authority, elite, expert type of narrative bias, right? Now that that's going away, we get this little state who comes out and says, right, the commission recommends that the governor and the legislator direct the New Hampshire Department of Energy to conduct a public review of how Bitcoin mining operations might be integrated into a statewide energy plan with positive impacts for the electrical system, including contributing to more stable electrical grid, more sustainable generation projects, and lower costs for consumers generally. It's there. It's over, right? It's over. Once everyone starts putting Bitcoin in the center of financing small parts of grid build-outs and all that stuff, and once we start really getting a sense of the Bitcoin and energy market, Bitcoin as the reference for the market is enough for hyper-Bitcoinization. As long as we measure energy markets in Bitcoin, we're going to win. There'll be no stopping it. And everything we see with this whole appeal to authority from the FBI and the CIA and all of these folks, just trust the experts, exactly what FBI Director Wray was saying at the WEF, right? All of that stuff, because it's now such a farce and so laughable and so stupid, given everything we know now about influence peddling in Twitter for the Twitter files around the vaccines, around lockdowns, around the Mueller report, around the Hunter Biden laptop. We see that they've been hiding criminals and for years. And once they lose enough of that appeal to authority and appeal to the narrative bias of that structure, it'll apply to everything, right? It won't just be the FBI. We're going to see the reckoning of central bank failures, and we'll be able to finally criticize folks like this Dutch person who doesn't even know what they're talking about, trying to give people advice on cryptos, right? So there's a domino here that can go, like we've been saying for a while now. It can go right from Kennedy, and just we can see the whole story as it approaches Biden and the efforts they've made to hide their corruption and the type of corruption that it is, right? So we're in a great time, right? Japanification. Yeah, that's what it is, Bitcoin graffiti. And Dimity says, I've been observing the inversion of language and projection you spoke about yesterday. Good stuff to be aware of. Yeah, projection is all about inversion of language. It's just, it's the way it works, right? What is your interpretation of Nakamoto? Pretty crafty name. Yeah, what does it mean again? From the center or no? Tell me what it means. Bitcoin graffiti? I don't remember off the top of my head what it means. I've seen it before though. I've asked Japanese people to translate it a few times, but you get different answers sometimes with that kanji reading, you know. Book in the middle. I didn't know that. Book in the middle. I didn't know that. Yeah, central book. Yeah. Okay, that's what I meant. Yeah. Yeah, I knew it had something to do with central. That I knew. But yeah, I mean, and even at that, that's something that I'm so glad about the op return script being used more in Bitcoin these days, honestly, because op return script and putting messages on the ledger to me was one of the best showing, not telling about Bitcoin things. That's why I used op return in 2015 for the entire Senate report that we wrote, right? I even got the Senate to pass the words, Senate believes Satoshi's invention deserves a light regulatory touch. That's in there. Block 36,000 something. And it's one of the weird predictions that I got wrong over the years. I thought the op return messages on the public ledger and just the concept of the public ledger would have a lot more traction than just the Bitcoin piece. I think it's headed back that way now. We see op return getting some attention and popularity now, and people starting to refer to the public ledger again, right? The piece of the public ledger is great, right? Freedom of speech, it is the best form of graffiti. Yeah. Unerasable messaging. Yeah, exactly why I wanted to use it. I wanted to expressly show that Bitcoin can back up into both property rights in America and freedom of speech rights, which is inevitably where we're headed. I did South by Southwest with Willy Woo in 2019 at the absolute bottom of the market, and that's all we talked about. That inevitably Bitcoin is safe because of the American Constitution, that we can back up into both freedom of speech and property rights in order to protect ourselves. So I continue to believe that, fully. All right, team, let me know if I missed anything. Go check out that the monologue Tucker gave on Nixon and the CIA, because it's amazing. I'm a fan of Nixon, and I'd already given up that public perception on him would ever change. And if you want, read that book. There's some things in that book that never left me, and one of them is a campaign picture of Nixon on the 72 campaign. Maybe it was the 68 campaign. No, it was the 72 campaign, right? And he stops at a diner, and someone picked up a photo of it. See him just on the bench of the diner like this, tired, right? He's been campaigning all day, and he's talking to just a normal guy next to him, right? And they're just talking about their day. Now, if you don't know about Nixon's life, he comes from Yorba Linda, outside of LA. Did not grow up rich. Went to Duke, but at the time Duke was not a big deal. And the Ivy League people always teased him about his poor education. And he had a chip on his shoulder for sure. No doubt about that. But this is what Conrad Black said in the book. He goes, just on that picture, right, of him sitting with another person, right? And your sense of seeing the picture is just two normal guys at the end of a hard day in a diner, on the bench, at the bar, on the stools, having a cup of coffee, eating, diner food. But it just looks normal. And his point was, he's the only president that could have produced that picture. There's no one else who could have produced it. Clinton could have sat with someone normally, but Clinton is too charismatic, right? It would have distorted the image, and the other person wouldn't have allowed for the picture to seem normal. Trump wasn't around back then, but it's the same idea, right? Trump can definitely sit in a diner and have a cup of coffee with a normal person, but it was the body language of the normal person next to Nixon. And that Nixon was able to make this person feel so normal because he himself was just a normal guy, right? And didn't really have that, didn't have any airs about him at all. Was a simple, straightforward American kind of guy that you can never come across. Probably though, and he makes the case in the book, probably with few exceptions, the strongest IQ, like just raw horsepower of almost any president that we've ever had. You ever see that? This is one of the best things Trump ever did, by the way. I saw a report a few months ago that was listing the IQs of the different presidents. And, it's hard to do because it's old, but they gave Trump the highest. And they cited, they had to tell where their IQ numbers came from. But they actually, so they said, this person had it tested or whatever. But in Trump's case, being the highest, it was just self-reported. Of course, Trump gave himself like some crazy number. It was like 180 or something. And they actually put it in the news, self-reported Trump and his IQ. Oh, Kevin says, audios, I'm still going to be changing the mic because I guess it is probably the moving around, and I like to move around. Probably going to get a standing mic, and that should take away some of the classic Trump. Yeah, classic. Yeah, it's too funny. I mean, what's your IQ? So high, the best IQ. Awesome. All right, team. Peace.